had their worst fears confirmed as true. In a wooded campsite only a half-mile away from their parked vehicle, investigators discovered the scene of what would go on to be one of, if not the most horrific crimes.
Welcome back to my channel, guys. I hope you have been having a great week. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe and leave a like on the video. It definitely helps me a lot with the YouTube algorithm, and you know I'm on the road to 1K. So today we'll be checking out a crime documentary, the most horrific crime in national park history. So let's check it out.
In May of 1996, Julie Williams and Lolly Winans headed down to Virginia's Shenandoah National Park to go backpacking on the Appalachian Trail and the surrounding trails in the wilderness. I'm sure that the start of their trip was quite peaceful. Shenandoah is beautiful, and since both women were from up north, it's no surprise they chose this park as the place for their late spring hike. But as peaceful as things may have started, the end was anything but. After not hearing from his daughter, Julie Williams' father contacted the authorities and reported the woman missing. He knew they were in the park somewhere,
which is natural.
Right,
you know, any concerned person would do that.
The searchers, the woman's friends and families, they all had their worst fears confirmed as true. In a wooded campsite only a half-mile away from their parked vehicle, investigators discovered the scene of what would go on to be one of, if not the most horrific crimes in national park history. And to make matters even worse, almost 30 years later, we still don't know who was responsible. This is the tragic story of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans. So I'm not gonna lie to you guys, this story is f***ed. There's nothing redeeming about it. There's no happy ending. It's a tough one. So now that you've been warned, we're gonna jump into the story. Although I do want to say real quick, my goal is to get this channel to 200,000 subscribers. It would mean so much to me if you would hit that subscribe button if you haven't done so already and help me get to that goal. All right, let's do it. On Sunday, May 19th, 1996, partners Julie Williams and Lolly Winans and their dogs set out for Shenandoah National Park in Western Virginia to do some backpacking. The trip was a celebration of a new job that 24-year-old Julie had recently secured in the Burlington, Vermont area. She was originally from Minnesota, but at the time was living in Richmond, Vermont, which is kind of crazy to me on a personal note because that's literally one town over from where I grew up in Jericho, Vermont. I would have been less than 5 months old at the time when this occurred. 26-year-old Michigan native Lolly Winans was described as a, quote, micro-drinking, fish-following, cigarette-smoking, good-time girl. She too had spent some time in Vermont during college and then had actually ended up transferring to Unity College in Maine. The couple met each other at Woods Woman in Minnesota, which was a non-profit organization focusing on education and adventure travel for women. Both women were drawn together due to their love of the outdoors and the wilderness, and eventually started a romantic relationship. On the first day of their adventure, Julie and Lolly entered Shenandoah National Park and stopped at Pinnacle's Overlook on Skyline Drive. Skyline Drive is a scenic road that runs the entire length of the park for 105 miles and features numerous trailheads, big vistas, campgrounds, and resorts. We know that Julie and Lolly stopped at Pinnacle's Overlook because they were actually carrying a camera at the time. This camera was later recovered by investigators, and its photos have allowed them, and now us, to retrace their adventure in somewhat broad steps. After stopping at the Overlook, the woman set out along the White Oak Canyon Trail for a few days and eventually hitched a ride off the trail with a park ranger to escape some rainy weather and to renew their camping permits. But it wasn't long before the couple set out again, this time climbing Hawksbill, which is the highest peak in Shenandoah, before eventually making their way to camp for the night. They chose a spot near a stream that was just off the bridle trail, about a quarter-mile away from Skyline Drive and a half-mile from where their car was parked at Skyland Lodge. This spot was also very close in proximity to the Appalachian Trail. Unfortunately, this would prove to be the end of the hike for the two women. It was now May 24th, And after this day, the two of them would never be seen alive again. Julie Williams' father was expecting to hear from his daughter after she had returned from the hike, and when he didn't hear from her by May 31st, he was getting very concerned. Concerned enough that on this day, he actually contacted the authorities, and they quickly started searching the park for any sign of the two women. It didn't take long before searchers found their first clue. They discovered the woman's car parked just north of Skyland Lodge off of Skyline Drive. Deputy Chief Ranger Bridget Bonet was quoted saying, "We started doing hasty searches to cover all those trail corridors in that general area to see if we could locate them. At some point during those hasty searches, we did locate the dog." That's right. The second clue into what happened came when the searchers found the two women's golden retriever wandering through the park with no leash and no owners in sight. And so, of course, they continued searching. And the next day, a gruesome discovery. On June 1st, 1996, rangers discovered the lifeless bodies of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans at their campsite. According to reports, it was a very violent scene. I'm not going to describe it on here in detail. It's too much. All I'm going to say is that
out to their
Lolly's
family and loved
inside
ones.
the tent, and Julie's body was found down an embankment about 30 feet away from the campsite. It was an absolutely horrific discovery, and obviously it launched the investigation into what had happened and who had carried out such a violent attack against the two hikers. It's likely that the two women were murdered just before or during Memorial Day weekend in 1996, which would have been a very popular time for tourists and other hikers to be visiting the park. So this, along with the fact that they were camped so close to the popular Skyland Lodge,
I just want to know why, man.
How did nobody discover the scene until days later when they were actively searching for the women? If somebody had discovered what had happened earlier, it's possible that they could have gotten a jump start on the investigation and maybe even have been able to stop the perpetrator before they left the park. Deputy Chief Ranger Bridget Bonet actually had an answer to this question. When talking about the campsite, she was quoted saying, "It wasn't a heavily used or heavily traveled trail. They were following the backcountry regulations at the time, which required them to be out of sight." Now, beyond this, I'm not exactly sure what the regulations were at the time.
Oh, okay, that's
interesting.
interesting.
To me, at least, that they've changed a little bit since the 90s. The website for Shenandoah National Park now says it is strongly recommended that you camp at pre-existing campsites. These campsites have been created and established by prior visitor use and are not posted, signed, or designated by the park. Having hiked through this area myself when I hiked the Appalachian Trail in 2018, I also know that at least along the AT, maybe along other trails too, I'm not sure, there are like official designated shelters and campsites as well. These rules do seem a little bit different than they were according to this Deputy Chief Ranger.
I mean, it was all the time,
backpackers
so
were supposed to just go off the trail and kind of be out of sight. So this is a little bit of a side note, but given such a violent crime occurred in like a very heavily trafficked national park, it's reasonable to think that the public may have been at risk. I would assume at least that the authorities would want to spread the word quickly, not only to help generate the investigation, but also to just warn people in the interest of public safety. But that's not what happened. Bizarrely enough, the National Park Service waited a full 36 hours before announcing to the public that the murders had occurred. They told everybody that it was a, quote, isolated incident and that the murders appeared to be random. Now, I'm sure they had their reasons for waiting so long to tell the public about this, but I don't know, it just seems weird to me that they waited so long, perhaps even a little bit negligent.
Yeah, I mean, because
this is what happened.
If something so horrible happens, you know, the best thing you want to do is ensure that people are aware of what's going on. So I definitely do agree with him. It is a bit shady and it's really sad.
And at this point, the investigation was on. Someone needed to be brought to justice for committing such a heinous crime, but in 1996, over 1.5 million people visited Shenandoah National Park, so it would be hard to find a suspect. Since the murders took place on federal land, that left the federal government in charge of working the case. The National Park Service teamed up with the FBI, although they did receive some help from the Virginia State Police's crime scene unit as well. And despite generating thousands of leads, no suspect emerged for over a year after the crime occurred. However, in the summer of 1997, all that changed. On July 9th, 1997, a female Canadian tourist was cycling on Skyline Drive when she was suddenly forced off the road by a man driving a truck. He began screaming sexual profanities at her and actually tried to force her inside the truck. Now, fortunately, the woman was actually able to fight the man off and break free. And at this point, he tried to run her over multiple times with his truck before eventually giving up and speeding off. He didn't get very far, and he was actually arrested as he was trying to leave the park at Swift Run Gap. And as if that wasn't scary enough, when investigators searched the man's car, they found hand restraints and leg restraints. So just like super, super scary stuff. The man was identified as Daryl David Rice, and he was a resident of Columbia, Maryland at the time. And surprisingly, he actually had no criminal record at the time, although he was recently fired from a job about a month earlier for being, quote, extremely hostile at work. It was during the interviews investigators conducted with Rice trying to figure out what the hell had happened that they became suspicious that he may have been involved with the murder of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans. Prosecution documents stated, quote, Rice became a possible suspect for a variety of reasons, including the obvious parallels in geographic location, the predatory behavior exhibited, and the exclusive selection of female victims. There was also another pretty damning piece of evidence that may have pointed at Rice, saying that he was responsible for the murder of the two hikers a year prior. Authorities recovered videos of him entering Shenandoah National Park on May 25th and May 26th, 1996, which was right around the time that Julie and Lolly would have been murdered. Rice denied
that makes sense.
Days, but he did admit to entering the park on June 1st, 1996, which was the same day that the two women's bodies were recovered. Rice eventually pled guilty to the attempted abduction of the Canadian tourist, and a few years later, in April of 2001, he was indicted for the murders of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans. Now, at the beginning of the video, I mentioned that these two women were a couple, and prosecutors actually believed that Rice had targeted the women because of their sexual orientation. Some of his previous actions and statements had indicated that he basically hated gay people. And so it seemed like the case may have finally been solved, but unfortunately, despite Rice's statements, despite the videotape of him entering the park, and despite the indictment, Rice was never convicted of the crime. In fact, his case never even went to trial. In 2003,
That's crazy.
that was found at the crime scene was tested. Before this, the only DNA evidence that prosecutors had was mitochondrial DNA that proved the killer's sex was male. When they tested this piece of hair, the DNA profile did not match that of Daryl David Rice. And given the rest of their case was largely circumstantial, the charges were dismissed without prejudice, leaving open the possibility that Rice could potentially be charged at a later date if more evidence was found. But that never happened. Rice did his time for the attempted abduction and was eventually released from prison in 2011. He was actually a suspect in another murder, one that had nothing to do with Shenandoah or the Appalachian Trail, but he was never charged in that case either.
Oh, this guy has been around. He's been busy.
There was actually another suspect in the murders, Richard Ivanitz, who died in 2002 and was connected to multiple other murders, though he was never named as more than a suspect in the Shenandoah murders. I don't think they ever really found solid evidence to connect him to it. And so that brings us to today. The investigation is still open, and I'm hoping that since DNA technology has progressed immensely since the early 2000s, and also since investigators apparently do have some DNA from the crime scene, that the families of Julie and Lolly will someday, hopefully soon, get some answers. But until then, here we are, nearly 30 years later, and we still don't know who committed one of the most horrific crimes in national park history. If you have any information about this case, please contact the FBI's Richmond, Virginia division, and of course, keep Julie Williams, Lolly Winans, and both of their families in your hearts. If you made it this far into the video, thank you for watching. I really hope that someday I can make an update to this video with the person responsible for these awful, awful crimes named and held accountable, but we don't know for now. If you guys enjoy these videos, if you've been watching to the end of these videos like you are right now especially, I would love it if you could check out the Patreon for my channel, patreon.com/ Kyle Hates Hiking. It's only a few dollars a month, and it is the #1 way to support my content. You're essentially just buying me a beer every month. You can just think about it that way. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you to all my existing Patreon supporters. And like I said, hopefully the families of the 2 victims will get some answers soon.